Feminism and critical theorists have identified that women are affected by patriarchy negatively from biblical times. Since then, women have fought for the recognition that makes them equal to men in all spheres of life. However, in each layer of society wherein women take up space, there remain blockages such as the remuneration glass ceiling and equal pay for equal work in the workspace. In personal relationships, women experience real threats of violence, and in the recent past, the word femicide has surfaced, which means the killing of women by their intimate partners. The South African Police Services in 2020 have reported that an average of 2,763 women have been killed by their partners between 2016 and 2020. Their names include, but are not limited to, Priska Skalk, 29 years old, who was killed in February 2017. She was found handcuffed and lying in a pool of blood at her Joburg CBD home in Commissioner Street. Karabo Mokoena, 22 years old, died at the hands of her boyfriend in April 2017. Bobby Kwabi, 24 years old, and her best friend Bongeka Pungula, 28 years old, were killed on May 12, 2017, after they had boarded a taxi at Maponya Mall in Klipspruit, Soweto. Macy Maisha, an 18-year-old matric pupil, was found dead with her eyes gouged out at the Soul City informal settlement on the West Rand. Her murder remains unsolved after the men initially arrested were set free. The focus of the paper is not femicide in itself, but the focus is women who are marginalized or in marginalized communities, turning gatekeepers of male-dominated systems. The statistics cited above are a simple demonstration of dangers that remain and are predominant in intimate relationships. It will specifically look at what women bring to the table that helps this patriarchally driven system to flourish, despite the effort made by education systems and the NGO sector to empower them. Using a qualitative analysis of data from 15 young women from Port Elizabeth townships, this paper will demonstrate that women have a role that they play, whether consciously or unconsciously, to keep the status quo in place. It will show that they are part of the tensions that are created within the circle of violence at societal level.
The literature that was reviewed was around patriarchy and relationships and patriarchy. I think what I would want to highlight at this point is the behavioral repertoire that speaks to behaviors that stem from patriarchy that are good and bad, are learned both by men and by women. And so they are internalized by them and even enforced by them as well. This is a very pertinent point within the study, because when we talk about the circle of violence, these are behaviors that are learned and reproduced because of socialization.
The works of Judith Butler, reflected in her work around performative construction of identity, were used as the lens that the researcher took to investigate the challenges that young women face by virtue of just being women. In her essay, Performative Acts and Gender Construction, an essay in Phenomenology and Feminist, Butler suggests that the body is born without knowing what or who it is, and what this who and what means. History, with its repeated traditions embedded in the things said, done, and experienced, create a cloak that then defines the who and gives meaning to what we are in relation to gender. We then become actors who hold this historical script and perform it according to what society historically dictates. Therefore, history becomes the director of who we are, and the symbols embedded in speech and body signs are the nuances that give the subtle yet powerful direction of how we should do gender. Gender acts affect us in such material, physical ways that even our perception of physical, sexual differences is affected by social conformities through statements like boys will be boys and girls must know their place. So Makana in 2013 purports that power imbalances in gender interactions remain the ideological stance that creates risky behavior. This forces the subordination of the female voice and the subordination of the body of the subject. Thus, sex for Butler is an ideal construct which is compulsorily materialized through time. In other words, it is not a simple fact or static condition of a body, but a process whereby regulatory norms materialize sex and achieve this materialization through the forcible reiteration of those norms. The environment within which young women find themselves cannot just be seen as a space of existence, but in itself must be seen as a form of power which exerts itself on them, thus subordinating and subjudicating them in a way that leads them to interact with other forms of power such as patriarchy. Butler, clarifying subjudication or subjection, states that it signifies the process of becoming subordinated by power as well as the process of becoming a subject. She goes on to state that the subject is initiated through a primary submission to power. If identity is looked at through this process of subjudication to power, then one can conclude that patriarchy is the mechanism or system which enforces itself onto young women generally. However, we cannot take for granted that the master, who at first appears to be external to the slave, re-emerges as the slave's own conscience, meaning that the subject is not passive to the act of being subjudicated as mentioned above, but passionately attached to his or her own subjugation. It would be irresponsible for me, however, to leave Butler's theory at this point, but prudent to substantiate that and state that she goes on to say the insistence that a subject is passionately attached to his or her own subordination has been invoked cynically by those who seek to debunk the claims of the subordinated. If a subject can be shown to pursue or sustain his or her subordinated status, the reasoning goes then perhaps final responsibility for that subordination resides with the subject. There is an obvious risk to this, and over and against this view, Butler maintains that the attachment to subjection is produced through the workings of power, and that part of the operation of power is made clear in its psychic effect, one of the most insidious of its productions. So the researcher can infer then that, as has been alluded above, the power actors within this research are the environment within which the young woman resides and operates in, the systems of patriarchy, culture, and religion that enforce and reinforce power upon them. Thus, this creates identities which they have to perform daily. Not only do they perform these identities, they socialize in them and thus become them. Those forces in our society who by default find themselves without a legitimate leg to stand to be recognized as essential and even as human beings have marginalized voices. Butler looks at how, for power to exist, it needs to legitimize itself and build on those who are voiceless and faceless. It is a well-known fact and has been purported by several researchers that Black women are at the bottom of the social pecking order. It therefore is not inconceivable that the pushback strategies that Butler in 2009 suggested can inadvertently be used against the very marginalized voices by the marginalized voices themselves. The researcher employed a critical ethnographic design that allowed her to study and understand society and critique and potentially change it through her work. The study was built on a wealth of already existing knowledge in the fields of social work, gender studies, and sexuality studies. The researcher sampled her participants from young women who had gone through the schooling system and completed grade 12, and who had enrolled in the Rise Out of School prevention programs steered by Ketimpilo and Port Elizabeth. A non-probability purposive sampling technique was used for the study as a qualitative sampling technique. Data collection took place through qualitative one-on-one semi-structured interviews, and participants were prepared accordingly through group information sessions and the signing of consent forms. The researcher engaged with inductive analysis, taking a particular interest in participants' discourse and behavior, and reflected on the cultural concepts presenting themselves through the data and the lens of power, privilege, and authority. Again, 15 participants were interviewed while observing the notion of data saturation, and the pilot study was conducted by means of interviewing a research participant recruited according to the sampling procedures described above. Data analysis was done using an emic approach, focusing on participants' attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, and practices as indicators of how they experience their social and cultural worlds. Peer debriefing helped audit the work being done and reflect critical questions, assumptions, and blind spots for the researcher by her supervisor to increase the study's credibility. Member checks were the second strategy to increase credibility, whereby the researcher went back to the research participants to evaluate whether what had been captured in the study was congruent to the initially collected data, through referring to the original theoretical framework to show how concepts and models would guide data collection and analysis. Transferability was achieved in the study. The researcher used the process of coding, which includes open coding, Excel coding, and selective coding, to achieve the first layer of dependability. Thereafter, the researcher applied selective coding, which was done by selecting one central category that connects all the codes from the analysis and captures the essence of the research. Themes and sub-themes were then drawn up to the point of selective coding. The theme that we're going to focus on for this particular study is patriarchy continuing to influence partners' expectation of relationships. The sub-themes that came out of that were men dictating the terms of the relationships, and that's the first sub-theme. I'm just going to focus on the actual codes that informed this sub-theme, which were power imbalance, manipulative behavior, unhealthy relationships, and the attitude from men that they are the macho men, they are the men in the relationship. The second sub-theme was risk of abuse remaining present within relationships. And the code that informed this sub-theme was peer support, the circle of violence, and exit plans. I'm not going to delve much into discussing the actual sub-themes at this point because of time. The next slide will inform our discussion around the two themes. The theme and sub-themes discussed above confirm the researcher's observations that the environment within which young women find themselves cannot just be seen as a space of existence, but it in itself must be seen as a form of power that exerts itself on them. thus subordinating or subjugating them in a way that leads them to interact with other forms of power systems such as patriarchy in a way that eventually adversely affects them. Thus, a circle of violence is created. If identity is looked at through this process of subjugation to power, then one can conclude that patriarchy is the mechanism or system which enforces itself onto young women and women generally. However, we cannot take for granted that the master, who at first appears to be external to the slave, re-emerges as the slave's own conscience, meaning that the subject is not passive in the act of being subjugated, as mentioned earlier, but passionately attached to his or her own subordination. The insistence that a subject is passionately attached to his or her own subordination has been invoked cynically by those who seek to debunk the claims of the subordinated. If a subject can be shown to pursue or sustain his or her own subordinated status, the reasoning goes then that perhaps the final responsibility for that subordination resides with the subject. There is an obvious risk to this view, and Butler maintains that the attachment to subjection is produced through the workings of power, and that this part of the operation of power is made clear in this psychic effect. And it's one of the most insidious of its productions. However, the attachment to power for the powerless remains real and tangible. The research findings confirms that there can be a turning against self and other, in this case the participants, against other women in the space. This would not only make those women who have attained power within the patriarchal system seekers of dominating other weaker women, but also gatekeepers of the system itself. The recommendations that I would like to put forward that came from the study for further study, that further research on the consequences of having a voice and how these are addressed be conducted, and that furthermore it would be worth our while as academia to look into research that might search for pockets of empowerment or empowering discourse generated by young people of diverse backgrounds as the actors who have histories, knowledge, and are part of the lived realities. These empowering narratives could be used to inform different sectors which impact on young women. Also, masculinities research that the researcher came across spoke mainly to hegemony and toxicity. This, of course, makes sense when one looks at the current environment within which society finds itself, of GBV, femicide, and other horrors directed at women and those groups that are or find themselves at the margins of society. However, the researcher would like to recommend further research on positive masculinities in as far as they empower young women and provide protective factors within their space. A similar study to this one with young men as a sample could be of benefit. And lastly, studies should be made readily available in a format that quickly speaks to young people to positively influence them and the broader society. The second recommendation, which speaks to policy change, practice, and training, the researcher would like to point out that the prevention programs in their design primarily focus on young women alone and neglect to include their male counterparts in the environment within which they exist or that they are socialized in. It neglects to consider the internalization of patriarchal notions of gender relations, in some instances where some men, both from traditional and modern backgrounds, think that erosive actions within relationships are normal due to this very socialization. These programs need to factor in that women's soul empowerment in this gendered space can be problematic, and thus need to include a gendered approach to be part of their program design. Thirdly, recommendation for design of interventions and empowerment programs. So many empowerment interactions reinforce patriarchy, and through these interventions, women and girls are told what to do, how to feel, and how to behave. No space is created for their voices to actually be heard. The subliminal message that the girl is at fault for the patriarchy that exists through focusing only on the young women as the subject to be empowered needs to be critically disrupted in the design of interventions and empowerment programs. Interventionalists need to challenge the impact, the environmental, social, and political drivers of patriarchy within the system in which the individual young women operates, such as school, family, church, and the broader society.